This is an important video for me to make because in the tech world, these non compete agreements are weaponized and used to keep people from working, but they're also used to keep people from starting startups. And now that this has happened, it is now federally illegal for anybody to try to force a vendor, worker, employee, intern, etc., to accept any kind of non compete agreement. And the important thing about this is that they're commonly associated with high level executives at technology and financial firms. So every single employee of a big FANG company now can legally start a company exactly like the one they work for if they want. That's heavy stuff. And it also calls into the fact that retention is going to be a big issue at tech companies because at the end of the day, a lot of people would rather just work for someone else instead of start their own thing. And I think what's going to happen is that with the removal of this, you're going to have companies that are bigger shrink a little bit as people leave, but you're also going to have them reevaluate their HR, recruiting, staffing, and retention solutions. And I think that's going to be ultimately good for the entire tech industry. I think that ultimately, at the end of the day, bigger companies will have the resources they need to use golden handcuffs in an effective way versus threats and non-compete agreements, which is what historically has happened. And so it's kind of clear that business groups are not happy with this because it blocks nearly all non-competes. And if you look at the actual information here, we'll go over it. Uh, it actually just ends up looking at the current situation and says you're not allowed to create new non-compete agreements. You're not allowed to enforce most old agreements. And the ones that you are allowed to enforce, you can only enforce basically once. And that's it. So you better play nice with those people because if you try to enforce it, guess what? There's still a geographic limit and there's still a time limit on most of these in most of these states. So if you really piss off the wrong executive that has a lot of money, all they have to do is move to Washington state or some other state that's already banned them at the state level. And at that point, they can do whatever the hell they want anyway because you're not allowed to enforce new ones. So check yourself before you wreck yourself is basically how I'm reading this entire thing. And so if you want to read the actual rule, it's up here. I'll add it to the link. But from what I've read, the entire thing basically gets summed down to no new non-competes, no enforcement of old non-competes unless you're a really high-level director. And even then, it would be sus, and you're going to have some limits, and you'll only be able to do against that one person once. So if you're willing to churn your entire leadership team or churn them out, sure, piss them off. But otherwise, play nice because you don't get the ability to do this again in the future, and it's going to hurt you in retention long term. And so, as a result of this, the final rule defines workers as a natural person who works or who previously worked, whether paid or unpaid, with regard to a worker's title or the worker's status under any state or federal laws, including but not limited to whether the worker was an employee, independent contractor, extern, intern, volunteer, apprentice, or sole proprietor provides a service as a person, aka any person. Okay? So, what that also means is that they're explicitly calling out vendors here. You can't have a non compete agreement with your vendor anymore. Either you do everything in house and everything's done in house, or you trust a party not to take over your business because that's what they just do their small part and they're so specialized at it they don't want to do anything else. That's going to change the dynamics of procurement, staffing, retention, everything. This is not going to just change software. This is going to change the world in America. Because what they've basically said is, look, we're sick of companies trying to keep other companies and other people from their own business. So you are now free to make your own Facebook. You are now free to make your own Netflix. You are now free to make your own whatever. And I'm using those, obviously those company names because they're big, but it's kind of an important deal because these giant companies also have a lot of vendors. And those agreements, I've personally seen some large companies use vending agreements that try to restrict competition. And they do that as a natural course of just trying to protect their business. Okay? It's not malicious. It's just them saying, hey, we're bringing you in. We're going to open the kimono a little bit and we're going to let you see some things you're not normally allowed to see. Don't use that against us. Don't use that to compete with us. They're not allowed to do that anymore. And so that's going to be very interesting. So the final rule, the one exception here, the final rule does not apply to a non-compete entered into by a person pursuant to a bona fide sale of a business entity. AKA, if you owned Facebook and you sold it to somebody else, you can't start your own Facebook at that point again. Like, you have to keep that agreement. That is something you've divested from yourself. You have to keep up with that. You have to actually keep your word on that. That's a really, really big limitation. And so as a result of that, you should really, really consider the fact that this is not going to hit a lot of people compared to the number of people who just got told, look, you don't have a non-compete. Okay. In addition, the final rule does not apply where a cause of action related to a non-compete accrued prior to the effective date. So basically, if you did something bad and you violated the non-compete before this ruling, suck it. That's just how it is. Sorry. You did bad. They're not going to let you get off the hook. But, I mean, you don't have a cause of action. I guess you're allowed to do whatever you want now. The final rule further provides that it is not an unfair method of competition to enforce or attempt to enforce a non-compete or to make representations about a non-compete where a person has a good faith basis to believe that the final rule is inapplicable. Basically, what they're saying here is, if I'm reading this correctly, remember, I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. That it's okay for them to enforce or attempt to enforce a non-compete or to make representations about a non-compete just because they think that this rule is BS. That doesn't make any sense to me. I'm not reading it right. Let's see what 16 here. Let's see 17 part VC. Let's just go here and just look that up because I want to see what section. Okay. See if it does this. Part VC. Okay, let's go back to here. Let's see here. VC. There's literally nothing here. That's interesting. So I'm definitely reading this wrong. Let's just go over it by line, okay? Pursuant to Section 5 and 6G, the FTC is issuing the non-compete clause rule. Not final rule provides an unfair method of competition and therefore a violation of Section 5 for persons, among other things, to enter into non-compete clauses with workers on or after the final rule's effective date. With respect to existing non-competes, aka non-competes entered into before the effective date, final rule adopts a different approach for senior executives than for other workers. For senior executives, entering non-competes can remain in force, while existing non-competes with other workers are not enforceable after the effective date. So, if I'm reading this correctly, I have never been a senior executive except a few times. So that's not entirely true. I have been. Those particular cases, dang, I can't start my own pharmacy company. Oh well, I guess I'll just not do that. But this is interesting because what they're saying is that look, there's a clear line in the sand. We're going to let the chips fall where we may, and there's going to be everything else is just fine. Basically, if you're a junior, senior, even just a principal level engineer, you don't have to worry about non-competes that way. And that's nice. That's really nice. That means if I'm reading this correctly, I don't have to worry about non-competes anymore. Final rule is effective. Insert date 120 days after date of publication to the Federal Register. And okay, so maybe it's not something that's happened yet. Alexa, remind me in 121 days that non-competes are now illegal at 8 a.m. that day.
What time? August 22nd. Should I remind you?
9 a.m.
Okay, I'll create a reminder for
So
August 22nd.
August 22nd. See. Further information, contact these people. And let's see, some supplementary information. Summary of the final rules provisions. Commission proposed a non-compete clause rule pursuant, blah, blah, blah. And based on their looking at it, they say, wow, this is sus. This is something that's going to, I'm going to paraphrase this. Based on the people they knew and their own ideas and review, and, consideration of everybody, including, some experts and all that fun stuff and people's public comments. The commission has decided that this rule is adopted, and this final rule addressing non-competes. Final rule provides that it's an unfair method of competition and therefore a violation of Section 5, aka illegal, for employers to enter into non-compete clauses with workers on or after the final rule's effective date. The commission also adopts a comprehensive ban on new non-competes for all workers. Damn. So you cannot be put into a new non-compete. And, if this also calls into question the fact that if there's a delay or a gap or something in this, then because of this declaration, companies may try to get people in the non-competes in that gap. Don't let yourself be party to a non-compete in that gap. Don't. Absolutely don't. I'm not a lawyer. I am not your lawyer. I am your friend telling you do not allow yourself. Just don't. Don't allow anybody to try to trick you into a non-compete. A lot of companies are going to look at this and go, we can't even try it now. It would be stupid. It's illegal. But there's going to be some sus companies out there that are like, oh, wait, we've got 120 days. Let's lock out the competition. And those people are the people you should be scared of. So if they try it, run. With respect to existing non-competes, i.e. non-competes entered into before the final rule's effective date, the Commission adopts a different approach for senior executives than for other workers. Existing non-competes with senior executives remain in force. The final rule does not cover such agreements. And they're listing a bunch of things here, which I believe are the exceptions. The final rule allows existing non-competes with senior executives to enforce because the subset of workers is likely to subject to the kind of acute, ongoing harms currently being suffered by other workers subject to existing non-competes, and because commenters raise credible concerns about the practical impacts of extinguishing existing non-competes for senior executives, aka they're worried about their companies going up in flames. For workers who are not senior executives, existing non-competes are no longer enforceable under the rule's final effective date. So basically, if you're not a director or above, in fact, maybe even if you are a director, maybe a director isn't senior enough. I don't know. We're going to read this and find out. you basically don't have to worry about non-competes anymore. And so one of the things that this kind of calls out is that there's a big difference that's perceived in companies if you're part of the leadership team or not. And so as a result of that, there is no way for you to, as an individual, if you're not being perceived as part of the leadership team, then they don't have to worry. There's no way that you have to worry about this non-compete because they didn't consider you to be valuable enough. So that's being called out right now. For workers who are not senior executives, let's see. Employers must provide such workers with existing non-competes. Notice that they are no longer enforceable. To facilitate compliance and minimize burden, the final rule includes model language that satisfies this notice requirement. Final rule contains separate provisions defining unfair methods of competition for the two subcategories of workers. Specifically, the final rule provides that, with respect to a worker other than a senior executive, it is an unfair method of competition for a person to enter into or attempt to enter a non-compete clause, to enforce or attempt to enforce a non-compete clause, or to represent that the worker is subject to non-compete clause. Oh, I see. So they can't even say that you're going to be subject to it because that's illegal too. Like if you can get them on record as saying that there's going to be one, then that's them breaking the law. That is fun. The commission describes the basis for its findings, practices, unfair methods of competition in parts B. Final rule provides that, with respect to senior executives, unfair method of competition for a person to enter into or attempt to enter a non-compete clause, to enforce or attempt to enforce a non-compete clause entered into after the effective date, or to represent that a senior executive is subject to a non-compete clause where the non-compete clause was entered into after date, aka anything that they try to do to say that there's a non-compete clause after this that's new, any kind of new thing, it's done. They are done. They are not allowed to do that. Let's see. They describe this in sections, blah, blah, blah. Defines non-compete clause as a term or condition of employment that prohibits the worker from penalizes the worker or prevents work from seeking and accepting employment work in the United States or a different person, or such work can be getting conclusion. Employment includes the terms of the condition or operate a business. So right there, just flat out call it out. You can work for other people or you can start your own business. It's fine. Let's see. And it's funny. That includes the term or condition, aka the final rule further provides that, for purposes of the final rule, term or employment of condition of employment includes, but not limited to, a contractual term or workplace policy, whether written or oral. Oh man! So they can't even legally, if I'm reading this correctly, they can't use any kind of anti-compete in any way. They can't say, "Hey, this is a condition of your employment." They can't do that. They can't even say, "Well, we have a policy," or they can't even say, "We have a company policy." They do that, it's illegal. That's flat out illegal. Like they've flat out said no. And the further rule defines employment work for a person, which means that's vendors as well. If you're a contractor, this still applies to you. You're still protected by this. Yep, and they actually went into this and they explained. Yep, wow, yep. And then of course if you bought Facebook and sold it to somebody else and then you had to do an uncompete as part of that, it's fine. You're allowed to do that because that's separate. That's not a so without like I said, I'm not a lawyer, but I do know enough business stuff to know that when you sell your startup or you sell your company, part of that is there are agreements in place to make sure that you don't have what is called a conflict of interest, aka you're not selling a company to somebody and keeping a clone of it in your back pocket so that you can sell that same company to other people as well. This is probably that in a different form, basically saying, look, if I have a company that makes widgets and I sell that widget making company to a venture capitalist or somebody else who legitimately wants to run that business and improve it, then I can't get into the widget making business myself. That's a non-compete agreement that you're allowed to sign. But not many people are in the widget making business, and they're not selling those companies and agreeing explicitly to stay out of that business as part of that so they don't have a conflict of interest. That is completely different than working as a tech worker or working as a sandwich shop employee or whatever. And so that actually seems reasonable. Like if you're off and you're out, selling widgets or selling companies that make widgets to people, you shouldn't be allowed to then immediately the next day start up a widget making company after you've sold your other company and you've agreed not to do that. Now, this does not mean that you are not allowed to sell that company to somebody and not agree to create a widget company because you're just done with that one and you want to, it's working, but maybe it doesn't do what you want. That is a completely different matter. But my reading of this says that it's really just about conflict of interest versus anything else. But then again, do your own due diligence, talk to your own lawyer, etc. Final rule does not apply to non-competes entered into of a person pursuant to a bona fide failed business entity, blah, blah, blah. And this is where we got tripped up before. Further provides that it's not an unfair method of competition to enforce or attempt to enforce a non-compete or to make representations about a non-compete where a person has a good faith basis to believe that the final rule is inapplicable. Okay, so with this extra context, I think what this is really saying is, look, it's okay to do a non-compete if I sold the business. Like, it's okay to enforce that against me if I sold widgets and then sold the company that made widgets. And it's not illegal for them to then come to me and say, look, you have non-compete. And that makes more sense. That's where we got tripped up earlier. So this is something that we actually need to just make clear. It's in relation to everything else here. And so it's still illegal to do non-competes. And it's still illegal to say, hey, look, you're just an employee, but we're going to have a non-compete. That's still illegal. I think what this means here is it's saying, look, you sold us the business that does it. You're not allowed to start your own other company. This is not illegal for us to say you have a non-compete in this instance. And that makes more sense. That honestly makes a lot more sense. So let's go over this. The final rule does not limit or affect enforcement of state laws that restrict non-competes with those state laws that conflict with the final rule, but it preempts state laws that conflict with the final rule. Ooh. So basically what they're saying is that if your state bans non-competes, then you're not going to be able to enforce new ones either. But maybe your state's and non-compete law that banned them, still allowed people to say stupid stuff like it's a corporate policy versus this is something you actually signed. And the state law says, oh, well, we allow that. And now the federal government's like, no, you don't anymore. Not anymore. You don't allow that anymore. So this is actually for every single state. And if you can find something in this federal law that protects you that your local state law does not, then you're protected by the federal law because it's higher on the order of operations. Furthermore, the final rule includes a severability clause clarifying the Commission's intent that if a reviewing court were to hold any part of any provision or application of the final rule invalid or unenforceable, including, for example, an aspect of the terms and conditions filed as non-competes, one of the more particular restrictions on competes or standards of application or category workers. The remainder of the rules stand in effect. That's actually pretty common in contract law. I know this because I have had a lot of training on it. I'm not going to go into that. I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. But I will say that I know enough to say that, and I know that because I, at one point, was going to go to law school, and I couldn't afford it. So I write code instead of laws, which is the same thing, really. Code enforces what people can do. Law says what people may or may not do. But if the code is written well, then they can't do that anyway. So, end result is that I'm not a lawyer. I'm not your lawyer. I don't practice law, etc., etc. The insert blah blah blah. Growing concerns about the harmful effect. Okay, now they're going to start talking about this, and you know what? I'm actually kind of curious. If I have, I wonder here. I'm going to take this link and I'm going to go an off-screen window. I'm going to download this into non-compete rule PDF. And then I'm going to load up ChatGPT. I'm going to have it summarize this for me. I'm going to see what it does. And basically, for most people, this is probably the end of the video. but I don't want to sit here and read 570 pages of legalese. And so I'm curious what it will spit out. Summarize what this says to me and explain the rules for how non competes can still be enforced. Let's see here. Ah, great. Nice. So basically, a nice little summary with ChatGPT. Uh, so existing non-competes and non. Wow, it actually read the PDF and it's summarizing it now. So summarize what it says to explain the rules for non-competes to be enforced. Spelling rule, whatever. Federal change final rule non-compete clauses explains that the rule effective from the date post publication deems it an unfair method. Great. Okay, so it's understanding everything. And for senior exist, let's see. Okay, so these are the limitations that it asks about. And this actually, I talked about this earlier. Accrued actions does not affect cases where a cause of action related to a non-compete accrued before the rule's effective date. That goes into the fact that what's going to happen is the next couple months, we're going to have companies checking for non-compete violations to try to get an action on the record before it goes into effect, because that's going to be them trying to clean house. And good faith exemptions. Okay, if you have a good faith exemption because of a sale of business, for example, it's perfectly fine. And basically, this provided the summary that basically explained everything I've already explained to you guys, which, nice. I think that's good. And I think that's a good time to stop. So, uh, have a good one.